Hi, I'm Charles Kasumba, and welcome back to The Compass. In this episode, Southern Voice's Tracy Mamoun and IPS Sri Lanka Executive Director Dushni Weerakoon are discussing an important question. Who controls the narrative about the Global South? This discussion highlighted how Southern-led approaches to research and storytelling can drive fairer, more contextually grounded development policies. Let's take a look.
So I'm Dushni Weerakoon, Executive Director of the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka. My institute focuses on economic policy research, cutting across from macro to trade to the micro sector like education, health, climate change, poverty, social protection, pretty much the entire sort of economic context from which we look at how we can influence government policy. So IPS is also semi-government under the Ministry of Finance in Sri Lanka, but we are operationally independent and raise our own funding. So in a sense, positioning in a sort of a bit of a unique situation in the think tank landscape.
Very interesting, probably even for what we're talking about here, because having that kind of independence, I suppose, allows you to shape your own stories. So since we're here to talk about narrative, I'm Tracy Mamoun, Head of Policy and Network Strategy at Southern Voice, which works to mobilize knowledge and expertise across a wide range of countries of the Global South to inform global policy. My background is communications, so a lot of what I do is, in fact, trying to tie these different pieces that are very diverse together to shape stories that can drive us forward. So happy to be here with you. But I mean, I think the first one we can really both talk about from different perspectives. So we're here to talk about narrative, storytelling. And the first question we have is, what implications does narrative ownership have for policy design and implementation?
I think this is something that, think tanks in a national context grapple with, because very often our experience has been that multilateral banks like World Bank, even ADB, or northern-based researchers work on very topical policy issues relevant to your country. They use our data and put forward their sort of recommendations and policy suggestions. Now, I see that they have an advantage in that context because they have access to comparative data sets, they have access to literature, they have access to financial resources, and they have access to a global media that we don't necessarily are able to tap. Second issue related to that I have also experienced is that our own governments also tend to rely on some of what is put forward by international agencies as opposed to what local research organizations and think tanks put forward, even though the evidence and the policy recommendations are very much the same. And that I would imagine is also to some extent because governments, there is a trust deficit. They might think that local researchers are biased in some fashion and they prefer to source their information from these outside sources. I think there is a happy place in which national research output and the work that is done by external researchers can coexist, complement each other. But I think that also needs a lot of work for think tanks in the Global South to be ahead of some of the issues that are being researched, because we are still, in some sense, behind the curve in terms of having access to the latest research methods and our training on how to communicate the findings to policymakers, still learning about it. So it is pretty much a challenge and something that I learned is not country specific. It's the same whether we are talking about Africa, Asia, or Latin America. From the 2 days of the Southern Voice Conference, it's very clear that a lot more needs to be done.
I was thinking about the question of happy place that you mentioned, sort of finding the sweet spot, because that is something that probably keeps me up at night a little bit sometimes. We have the data, we have the evidence, but how do we tell a story that is going to make people connect? I think it's something that I find very vivid at the moment in a climate project, a climate-related project that we're working on, because this is something that is affecting everybody, the Global South, countries of the Global South a lot more, but it is affecting our lives. It's tremendously changing the world that we live in. But if we're talking about this as a question of a couple of degrees, that's not something that's going to keep people up at night. And so that is not necessarily going to stimulate the same kind of action, the same kind of pressure, etc., bringing other people in. So I think for that reason, it is extremely important to lean into that side.
I understand what you're saying, but I think that the biggest challenge we have to sort of counter that narrative is dealing with the global media, right? And I'll take one example from the Sri Lankan experience. Now, Sri Lanka has had a long relationship with China. China was investing heavily in infrastructure, in ports, etc. In 2018, one of the ports that China built, the Sri Lankan government decided that, China would be better situated to sort of run it more efficiently. And then they asked China, do you want to buy that port? Now, the narrative that was picked up, and particularly in the media in the US, the New York Times, for instance, ran headlines that Sri Lanka has been caught up in a China debt trap, that we were forced to concede this port to China. Now, for us, working on debt issues in Sri Lanka, we know the numbers, and we know what was really behind the Sri Lanka sort of building debt crisis, and it had very little to do with China. It had, all the other elements. But we have no access to that kind of media, and once a New York Times has the headlines, you find every other outlet that is sort of building their own story on the China narrative, picking it up. So, however much we write about it and in the national media in our own countries, it doesn't get picked up. Right? So we were also thinking, how can we put our side of the story forward? And we looked at regional platforms that are, not South Asia based, but larger Asia based platforms that would pick up an article that we've written counter to what was said in that. And that got some traction. So I think it's, it's very difficult to, because we lack that training, even during the economic crisis that Sri Lanka went through. We had so many international media houses contacting us. They would interview, but then they take 20-second clip. And when you finally listen to that broadcast, you realize that they have inserted that 20-second clip to a narrative that had already been sort of, it was their story and going in a direction that clearly they wanted it to run.
I wonder if this is something that connects to actually the final question that we have here on the matter of collaboration. I'm curious if you think that, aside from the training, in the context of Southern Voice, different countries coming together, building a shared narrative can potentially change a little bit that dynamic. Or
I think it does. I mean, there were so many forums in which I found that I was a panelist, and my colleagues from Pakistan were also called on to be panelists. Because Pakistan was also going through a sort of similar crisis of debt build-up at the time, close relations to China, etc. And at some point we realized that we were being steered in a particular direction, and then we had our own bilateral conversation about where do we want this next webinar to go.
Yeah.
And we took it in the direction that we wanted it. So I think, collective of think tanks like we have in Southern Voice really builds up. It's not just the one voice, but there are so many voices that come on top of each other that becomes a much more persuasive and convincing way of putting the Southern sort of views and opinions to the global audience in a more effective way. And you're a communicator. And I would imagine you have loads of lessons for us, on how to do it.
It's absolutely noted, but it was very interesting to me when you brought up the question of the context and, whether it's taking a clip or a little thing that somebody has said out of context. I think it connects also to sometimes when you take the data out of context, and it comes back to this thing that is so fundamental for Southern Voice, is it our tagline or motto is Southern perspectives, global debates. It's not about just Southern data or Southern evidence, global debates. Perspective has a lot to do with also the stories that we shape and how we contextualize this data. And if I go to this question of our work that we conducted over the last couple of years on equity in research, I learned certain things that were unfortunately new to me. That's generally a matter of some degree of ignorance of how deep these issues run. But so we were speaking to experts across the Southern Voice Network, people like yourself, who are extremely qualified to talk about the subjects that they have studied for years, who are experts in their field and who are still being put in positions many times of being data collectors and analysts, while their counterparts in other countries are shaping the story, which is completely nonsensical and which completely decontextualizes what we're talking about and risk actually telling the wrong story or telling a story that does not benefit why this data was even collected in the first place, that is potentially going to benefit what might be the strategic agenda of the partner in another country. But if we're not ourselves putting the data in the context that we want and shaping that story, that can be extremely dangerous, in fact. And it's true that in this day and age, we see that a lot, for example, on social media, with the fake news. You take a little piece of something, you completely decontextualize it, and the story is not even close to say the same thing, and the impact, therefore, tanks completely. So
it's very important that body of work is being done. I know my colleagues from my institute were involved in some of the webinars that were done on the and she kept sort of pushing these out to all of us, saying, when you are negotiating on your research collaborative work, make sure that the consultant rates are not 10 times what the local researchers are paid, because that's where I think the inequities start. Because even if you do a joint collaboration and you have a pool of funds, and when you start to split it up, you find that you're left with very little, because their remuneration rates are so much higher in the north that the bulk of that funding goes. And it's not always helpful. Sometimes when you bid for international grants, for instance, EU grants also, most of the time they say you have to have a research partner that's based in the EU to qualify for that project. So, these are sort of challenges that we need to overcome. But I think we're getting there slowly. So I have attended a Southern Voice Forum for the first time. And I was just watching the interaction amongst this diverse group of scholars from Asia, from Latin America, from Francophone Africa, from West Africa, grappling with language. But the energy and the enthusiasm to sort of focus on building research capacity and influencing policy in our own countries and in the global south collectively, that commitment is such gives you a lot of hope. And in particular, seeing some of the younger think tankers coming up. And I think that generation is perhaps even better placed to take forward the agendas that have been identified. I'm hopeful that we are going to be in a better position in 10 years from now.
I think the last thing that you mentioned about young people, I am myself 34 years old, but there is a generation that is younger than me that gives me a lot of hope as it relates to the future, because they're shaping, for example, a lot of stories about justice and really changing how we talk about things. And that gives me very much a lot of hope for a number of things, but including collaboration. I think here as well, we've come together this time in a context of crisis in many ways. It could be easy to expect that when everyone is stretched for funding, stretched by a very unstable political environment, stretched by a lot of things, it's almost human nature to potentially become a bit competitive.
Yes.
And it's absolutely not what I've been seeing here. In fact, and in a lot of the spaces that we work in, I really see this desire to come together, and sometimes a desire to come together where the only incentive behind it is actually how are we going to build these stories that will carry us together. Sometimes the work that I lead doesn't even have a financial incentive behind it.
Right.
People are just coming together for the sake of bringing their ideas together and shaping something. That in itself gives me hope.
Thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned for next week, where we'll discuss research ownership and data gaps and the steps our network is taking to bridge those. See you then.
And by bringing together those of us who generate primary data to pool our resources, how we measure something may be useful to somebody else. That's some other think tank in Nigeria or Indonesia or wherever. They don't need to reinvent the wheel.